Hi everyone. I wanted to talk to you about an idea that you might not have heard of in debates between creationists and evolutionists. So, Young Earth Creationism says that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and science says that it's about 4.54 billion years old. So that's a factor, like if you divide one by the other, that's a factor of 750,000, okay, about that. So obviously somebody's very wrong in this debate. Now, the idea that I wanted to draw your attention to is the fact that the moon that orbits the Earth, it's got a lot of impact craters on its surface. And we also find those on Mars and Mercury and some of the moons of the gas giants. So like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, they also have got, those moons have also, or the moons orbiting them, right, have got a lot of impact craters in many instances. And also asteroids have got many impact craters. So there's a lot of evidence all over the solar system for impact cratering and therefore the violent history of the solar system. Now, if you look at the moon, it's got something like 1 million impact craters on its surface, which are at least 1 kilometer or more in diameter. Okay, so just from that category, there's at least 1 million. If you're talking about impact craters which are about 5 kilometers or more, then it's about 300,000. But it's still a massive amount. Similarly on Mars, there's like hundreds of thousands of impact craters, and we find many, many thousands of impact craters on Mercury as well. Now, the problem for young Earth creationism is that you have to account for all of those impact craters on the moon happening within a very small amount of time, so 6,000 years, okay? Now, the problem there is that you're compressing all of those energetic events down to a very, very small time scale. So you would have to say that the impact events were happening at a frequency or a rate of 750,000 times greater than what science says to get the same amount of cratering that we actually observe empirically on the surface of the moon. Now, that's a problem because for so many objects to be impacting so frequently on the moon's surface, you would have to have a similar amount in the near-Earth environment also affecting the Earth. So not necessarily always hitting the Earth's surface, because the Earth does have an atmosphere, and that can burn up the meteorites coming in many cases, but at least skimming or entering the atmosphere and creating very spectacular like fireball events that can be seen from the ground. In fact, you can see some of these on YouTube, because these objects are still flying around the solar system, and they are sometimes, although not as frequently these days, impacting with celestial bodies. So in order to account for the amount of cratering that we see on the moon in that very small space of 6,000 years, you would need a corresponding amount of near-Earth objects which are also interacting with the Earth at a very high rate, much higher than the average that science says was happening throughout the history of the Earth with its 4.54 billion year history. Okay, now obviously that causes many issues if you're somebody living back in the chronology of the Bible, witnessing these events, because these are very, very energetic events. So if something does impact the surface, it could be like multi-megaton energy release. So it's not just the impacts, though, that would be noticed and experienced, but it's also just like the atmospheric interaction. So the fireball events, they would have to be happening at a very, very high frequency and pretty much constantly, like day and night, happening all the time. People would definitely have reported that, and if that was true, then it would have been in Genesis and in the Bible more generally, right? But that's actually not what's described in the Bible. There are some reports of celestial events in the Bible, but not at the frequency which would be required to make it consistent with what we see on the moon with its amount of cratering. So that's obviously a contradiction. Now, the Earth does have a substantial atmosphere, more than Mars, which used to have a substantial atmosphere before its geological processes slowed down, and then its atmosphere sort of started to interact more with the sun, and then it got degraded over time. So the Earth has got a much more substantial atmosphere than Mars does, and it protects us from many objects which would otherwise impact the surface. But some of them do get through. So there are about 190 documented impact craters that survive to the present day on the Earth. They have not yet been rescoured by the atmosphere with its weathering of wind and water weathering and the geological processes going on our planet, like plate tectonics and subduction of rock, etc. So those processes can cover up evidence of impact craters over time, which is why you see on the moon so many, because the moon is basically dead. It's got very little geophysical activity. But on the Earth, there's a lot of that sort of activity. So that tends to cover up the evidence of these impact craters. But we still do find hundreds of them still surviving to this present day. Now, they would necessarily have been more frequent in the past, or there would be many cases where we can't find evidence for them, but they still surely happened. But again, with a 6,000-year-old history, the rate would be hugely greater than what we think was the average for the Earth throughout its entire 4.54 billion year history. So it would have to be, again, 750,000 times greater, the rate of re-entry or of entry of these objects, interaction with the atmosphere, and impact as well, because some of them will get through. But that's not what's reported by the characters in the Bible, which is very odd because these were agricultural societies, and they would notice that their crops were failing constantly because of nuclear winter type effects. All the dust being kicked up into the atmosphere, blocking off sunlight. Those things would be constantly going on if there was so much near-Earth object activity happening. Now you might think, well, maybe the flood, Noah's flood, can rescour the surface and get rid of the evidence for those impacts. But again, this just adds another energetic event in addition to the meteorites, and also it further compresses the amount of time available for those impacts to happen. So now we're talking pre-flood, because you're saying that the flood got rid of the evidence for the impacts. Well, now you have to say those impacts mostly happened before the flood, which just gives you less time, and therefore there's a higher energetic intensity coming into the Earth, right? So that doesn't fix the problem. It just makes it worse, actually. So it's very interesting that we can look at the universe empirically and measure it and get an idea of the sorts of events that happened in the past and the rates at which they happened. And also, could a celestial body withstand a certain amount of energetic input given a certain amount of time? So the more spaced out it is, the easier it is for that object and any living things on it to survive. But if you compress it to a very short time and you have the same number of events happening, that makes it very difficult for anything on the surface of that planet to survive, right? And it's very dubious to think that anything could have survived if the Earth was, only 6,000 years old. So this is a major problem for young Earth creationism. Anyway, thanks for your time.